So when you think of the War of 1812, what comes to mind? Probably our national anthem, right? And, well, that's usually about it. It kind of gets written off as this weird little sequel to the American Revolution, like a forgotten post-credit scene. But what if I told you this forgotten conflict was actually this incredibly complex, multi-front war? I'm talking hidden diplomatic battles, secret treasonous money-making schemes, and a legacy that literally reshaped the entire continent. Okay,
And that's the big question, isn't it? It's a total paradox. How does a war that gives us some of our most iconic national symbols just fade into the background? We all know the song about the bombs bursting in air over Fort McHenry, but we've forgotten pretty much the entire story that goes with it. The reasons why, it turns out, are just as fascinating as the war
Now, on the
itself.
surface, the lead-up seems pretty straightforward. You got Britain and Napoleon's France in this epic global smackdown, and American ships are caught right in the middle. The British Royal Navy was desperate for sailors, so they started boarding American vessels and just taking them. It was called impressment. And by 1812, they nabbed something like 15,000 American sailors. So the US officially declared war for free trade and sailors' rights. But here's the thing. Those reasons, which were a huge deal back then, just don't really hit home for us today. And that's part of why the whole conflict feels so distant.
Dig into why this war is so often overlooked. It's about more than just a confusing cause. It's also about how the war was framed in people's minds, how it was fought, and crucially, how it ended.
You have to understand, for a lot of Americans at the time, this was simple. This was round two. They saw it as the final chapter of the revolution, a chance to stand up and prove once and for all that the United States was a real country that wasn't going to be pushed around by its old colonial boss. It was a simple, powerful, and very patriotic story. But that simple story was hiding a much
And this
messier-
quote from Henry Clay just nails it. A lot of people think the US just wanted to grab Canada, but that's a total strategic misunderstanding. Think about it. The US had no chance of taking on the Royal Navy out on the open ocean. So the only place they could actually put pressure on Great Britain was by hitting them where they lived in North America, Canada. Canada wasn't the prize, it was the leverage. It was the only tool America had to force Britain to deal with its complaints about ships
That
and
fight up
sailors.
north was only part of the story. Away from the famous battlefields, there were actually two secret wars going on. One was a game of high-stakes diplomacy, and the other was all about treason for profit. Let's start with the diplomats. Man, this quote is so telling. You can just years before the war even started, this British official perfectly described the empire's worst nightmare in North America, getting caught in a crossfire between the French, the Americans, and powerful indigenous nations. That fear, that deep-seated vulnerability, basically dictated every move Britain made in the region. They knew they couldn't afford to fight everybody at the same time. Now, when we think of indigenous involvement in the war, our minds usually go west, to military leaders like Tecumseh and his Confederacy fighting right alongside the British. But in the East, a totally different conflict was playing out. This was a war of words, treaties, and spies, not muskets. Nations like the Mi'kmaq and the Passamaquoddy held the real balance of power, and the British weren't trying to recruit them as allies. They were desperately trying to convince them to stay neutral.
Different playbook.
So why
Well, the British knew they were weak in the East. They had these small, scattered settlements with this massive, impenetrable wilderness behind them. They just didn't have the manpower to control it. And they knew that if the Eastern nations sided with the Americans, their forces would be, in the words of one general, formidable as enemies. So instead of fighting, they talked. They negotiated a whole series of neutrality agreements in 1812, all to keep the region peaceful and avoid fighting a disastrous war on two fronts.
So while the diplomats were busy keeping the peace, a whole other group of people, both American and British, were busy getting rich. This was the second hidden war, one where the line between being a patriot and a traitor got very, very blurry. You are not going to believe this. It was called a collusive capture, and it was basically treason for fun and profit. Here's how it worked. A British merchant in Canada loads up a ship with goods that were illegal to import into the US. Then, he'd have a secret meeting with an American privateer. That's a private ship authorized by the government to attack enemy merchants. They'd stage a fake battle, the American ship would capture the British cargo, and then sail it right into a US port. As a prize of war, the illegal goods were suddenly legal, and they'd be sold for a fortune, with both sides splitting the cash. It was an absolutely brilliant and completely illegal way to get around the wartime.
And how do we know
embargoes.
about this? Because they got caught. In one case, a privateer called the Lydia was about to be seized. A crewman runs to the rail and hurls a packet of papers overboard. Now, this packet was wrapped in lead bands, specifically so it would sink like a stone, but somehow it was fished out of the water, and inside, it was the whole scheme.
Coded letters, instructions, licenses from British officials, everything. The proof was right there. This wasn't just a one-off thing, it was a huge organized conspiracy.
Got the official war, the hidden diplomatic war, and a secret economic war. With all of that going on, is it any surprise that nobody can even agree on who won? Seriously, the answer to who won the War of 1812 completely depends on who
Let's just run down the scorecard. For the United States, it was a glorious victory that established them on the world stage. At least that was the story they told, thanks mostly to a huge win at New Orleans that happened after the peace treaty was already signed. For Canada, just holding off the American invasion was a massive win that helped forge a national identity separate from the US. For Great Britain, honestly, it was just an annoying sideshow to the real war against Napoleon. But for the First Nations, the outcome was crystal clear, and it was a catastrophe.
Look at that number, 23 million. That's how many acres of land the Creek Nation was forced to sign over to the United States after being defeated at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which was a critical battle within the wider War of 1812.
The other guys can debate who got the better end of the deal. For indigenous peoples, there was no debate at all. The Treaty of Ghent, the document that officially ended the war, was a profound betrayal. The British allies just left, abandoning them to face the unstoppable expansion of the United States all alone. For them, there was no victory. It was an absolute unmitigated.
Which brings us all the way back to the beginning. If this war was so complicated and the outcome was so messy, why did it become the forgotten conflict? Well, maybe it wasn't forgotten at all. Maybe it was just absorbed. Its legacy is literally all around us, just hiding in plain sight.
Just think about it for a second. The Star-Spangled Banner, War of 1812. The legendary warship the USS Constitution. It got its famous nickname Old Ironsides from a battle in this war. The character of Uncle Sam. He became popular during this war. Even classic American phrases like "don't give up the ship" and "we have met the enemy and they are ours" are direct quotes from this conflict. We know all the cultural the hand that left them.
So maybe the War of 1812 wasn't so much forgotten as it was hidden. A war whose messy, complicated realities of diplomacy and treason and conquest got smoothed over by a much simpler, more heroic story. Its real consequences were never forgotten. They just became the very foundation of the North America we live in today. And that makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other parts of our history aren't really gone, but are just hiding in plain sight?